In 1920, a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov discovered a theory called classical conditioning. Pavlov was originally conducting an experiment to see how digestion works in mammals. He tracked what triggered dogs to salivate. He thought the dogs would only salivate when presented with food. As his experiment went on, he observed that the dogs began salivating as he walked towards them. This made him curious. He altered his experiments to see why this change occurred. To test it out, he sounded a bell, fed the dogs, and recorded the dogs' response. At first, the bell had no effect on the dogs. As he regularly repeated the experiment, the dogs began to salivate at the sound of the bell. By repeatedly pairing the bell and the food, the dogs began to salivate at the sound of the bell even when there was no food in sight. From this experiment, Pavlov created the theory of classical conditioning. He defined it as the association of automatic responses with new stimuli. For classical conditioning, there are some key vocabulary to know: unconditioned response, conditioned response, unconditioned stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and neutral stimulus. Unconditioned responses are naturally occurring responses, like a dog salivating when they're given food. Conditioned responses are learned responses to a previously neutral stimulus. This would be the dog salivating at the sound of the bell. An unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that automatically produces an emotional or physiological response, so food would be the unconditioned stimulus for the dog. Neutral stimulus is a stimulus that is not connected to a response. This would be the bell at the beginning of the experiment. Conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that evokes an emotional or physiological response after conditioning. This would be the bell after Pavlov repeatedly paired it with the food. While Pavlov studied the involuntary responses of organisms in the 1920s, B.F. Skinner studied voluntary responses of organisms in 1938.
B.F. Skinner started his lifelong studies of operant conditioning with the release of his book, The Behavior of Organisms, an Experimental Analysis, and how it applied to not only our furry friends, but for people as well. Operant behaviors are behaviors that people or animals do voluntarily. To test how operant behaviors could be affected by reinforcement, Skinner developed the operant conditioning box. In his experiment, he placed a mouse in a box with a lever connected to a door that held food. The mouse sitting inside the box is an example of the antecedent, or the events that precede an action. The mouse soon learned that if it pressed down on the lever, the door with food would open up. This is an example of a consequence. The mouse pulls on the lever, the mouse gets the food. Soon the mouse pressed down on the lever quite frequently in order to get more food. This is an example of reinforcement, as giving food to the mouse increases the behavior to pull on the lever. Skinner devised a plan to test the opposite. Rather than rewarding the mouse with food, he presented the mouse with a small electrical shock when it touched the lever. This is an example of punishment, where the mouse is discouraged for touching the lever. This study of operant conditioning has led the mouse either to pull the lever to earn food or to leave the lever alone to avoid being shocked.